Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Welcome, everyone, to USS Hornet. It's a delight to have all of you here. I'm 09APR2022, and I am just making a simple public service announcement. We are voraciously running behind, so please bear with us as we get through our logistics. But we are very happy and thrilled to have all of you here today. We have a full program for you, and we're excited to share it with you. So just know we are running a little bit behind, but we are very appreciative of you being here. Thank you.
Ano pa ng konti. Yan, tutol dito. Yan, isa pa. Pang mahaba.
Yes. They're the same as you guys have here. I mean, they're Shure, and the brand is Shure, and you do not need phantom power.
Wala, I don't think gamitin na dito. Ayan o, nandun na si Bobby.
Sound check. Okay, next.
Hello.
Sound check. Good. Okay.
Can you check again?
It might have run a third cable thing. We're going to do more.
Sound check.
Let's see where it goes.
Testing.
Yeah, we'll just stop this now. Okay.
Tinatanggal ko lang yung effect niya.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And thank you so very much for being here today. We need to start our panel discussion on the bombing of the held ships Oreokomaru and Oreokomaru by Air Group 11. As you can see, this is an event of remembrance and reconciliation, and we have descendants of both groups in the panel discussion. And this is the first time that descendants from both groups, right, are gathering together to talk about this. So thank you for being here early. And we want to thank our proud sponsors, Ryan Stinson, in memory of his grandfather, Captain Calvin L. Swartson of the 45th Infantry Regiment, Philippine Scouts, Ambassador and Mrs. Howard Leach, in memory of the men of the 40th Tank Battalion of Salinas, California, which became Company C of the 194th Tank Battalion, and Joseph McMicking, who was with the Philippine Army Air Corps and the U.S. Army Forces in the Far East, General Headquarters, Southwest Pacific area. By the way, with the 40th Tank Battalion, there were, I think, 147 men from Salinas who went to the Philippines, and only 47 survived. VFW 8750, in memory of Sergeant David Tejada of the 12th Signal Company, Philippine Scouts. VFW 4618, San Francisco, Chinatown Post, in memory of Lieutenant Colonel Wallace Levine. And Mrs. Consuelo Hall McHugh and family, in memory of Roderick Hall, who was an honorary member of the Bataan Legacy Historical Society, who passed away in January of this year. And he was the co-founder of Memorare Manila 1945, which enabled the commemoration of the Battle of Manila, which happened between February 3 and March 3, 1945. So with that in mind, let's start our, I'd like to introduce, next slide please. Next. The first speaker is our moderator, James Erickson. He's an associate professor of biology at Texas A&M University. By the way, this is the second time that he's speaking before a Bataan Legacy event. He spoke about the health ships several, I think, believe 2017. Yes. He's the eldest son of Major Albert Erickson of the 71st Infantry Regiment. And Dr. Erickson began researching Philippine POWs with a special emphasis on health ships more than 20 years ago. Our next speaker is Mark Kelso. He's the grandson of 2nd Lieutenant Walter Kelso. He's a native of Galveston, Texas. He currently serves as Social Studies Department co-chair at Ball High School in Galveston, Texas. And his grandfather, 2nd Lieutenant Walter Kelso, was with the 19th Bomb Group, HQ and HQ Squadron. Next. Now, John Duresky grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and he spent a year in Japan from 1973 to 1974 and worked there and the U.S. at Nissin Shokuhin Kabushiki Taisha for 6 years. He did most of the research for a book about Chester Britt of the 92nd Coast Artillery called Relentless Hope. And you can buy it, I think on Amazon. Is that Amazon, John? Yes. The book was written by Chester St. David, but John here did most of the research. He's a relentless researcher. And George Retelas here, next please, is a film director and photographer from the Bay Area. His acclaimed documentary 11 follows 11 World War II veterans that flew with Air Group 11, and his namesake grandfather, who's up there, was an aviation machine made second class with Air Group 11. Next slide, please. Tim Hampton is a former Marine, a naval historian and archivist, and a current member of the CEO's Advisory Council at the Hornet. And that is the uncle of his wife, right? And he got you inspired to do this. And he is also an executive producer of the film. He's on the current member of the CEO's Advisory Council at the Hornet, and he and his wife Katie have been volunteering at the Hornet for over 15 years. And Air Group 11, by the way, has a museum downstairs, if you wish to see that after the event. So with that, let's start the program. Next slide, please.
Try it now. Try it now.
I'll just use this one.
I got it.
Oh, got it. Okay, here we go. Welcome. I'm delighted to see you all here. My job as moderator is what I'm going to do is give you a brief introduction to the Hell Ships, focus to set the stage for the people who are going to give most of the presentation. It's going to start with a presentation on Air Group 11 by George Retelas, and then we're going to tell the story of the Oroyoku Maru series of Hell Ships. John and Mark are going to take us through that story. And at the end, we're going to open this for a question and answer session. Please hold your questions until the end. Since we're running behind, we're going to try and make this move pretty quickly. Next slide, please. So the Hell Ships are the generic term that describes the terrible ships that the Japanese used to transport prisoners of war from all over the Pacific, from Singapore, from Java, from the Philippines, to various places in the empire to serve as slave laborers. And overall, there were at least 130 Hell Ships. They haven't all been identified. About 126,000 prisoners of war were transported aboard those. Some many times. Some experienced this 5, even 6 times. If they were lucky enough to survive. But amongst those, all those voyages, nearly 20,000 prisoners of war perished. Those include slave laborers or Indonesian slave laborers, as well as formal military prisoners of war. And they involve nationalities across the globe. They're kind of listed at the bottom. Next slide, please. What I want to do is briefly focus on American POWs from the Philippines because we have the best numbers for those, the most complete story. And so about 21,000 American POWs Americans were captured. Okay.
There.
How about that? Yeah. Is that good? Okay. Was I echo or too loud? Too quiet? Okay. All right. There were about 21,000 Americans who were held as POWs by the Japanese, or were captured in the Philippines. Of those, 11,300 were liberated. Nearly 10,000 died. So it means that nearly half of the men taken prisoners, Americans taken prisoners in the Philippines, perished as POWs, 47%. 5,000 or so of those died in the Philippines. That includes the Death March, that includes Campo Danel, it includes Cabanatuan. But 4,720 died elsewhere. That includes Japan, but importantly includes the Hell Ships. So next slide, please. Okay. So the Americans who were transported to Japan, to Korea, to Taiwan to serve as slave laborers. There were about 14,000 that were put aboard Hell Ships. 9,000, almost 10,000 survived the war, but 4,720 of those men died. They were transported in Hell Ships. 3,500 plus died at sea, either as a result of sinking or the conditions directly aboard the Hell Ships. But the dying didn't stop when a Hell Ship was done, because many of those men died shortly after arrival. So all the POWs, American POWs who went to Manchuria, went to Korea, went to Japan, 1,190 of them died, but half of those died within 10 weeks of arrival because the hell ships were so terrible, the conditions were so awful that the men arrived and they just couldn't be saved. And so the toll of the hell ships is not just the sinking, it's not just the bombing, it's not just the aboard deaths, but there's an aftermath that had a huge impact on the POWs. Next slide. So one thing I want to do that is going to be probably the hardest thing to do as someone who speaks about the hell ships is to try and convey some sense of what it was like aboard. It's indescribably, unimaginably awful. So we can only approximate it. And I think the best thing to consider is to use some of the artwork that exists. And so POW artist named Ben Steele has really produced, I think, the best, most powerful image of what it was like to be aboard a hell ship. So Ben Steele was aboard the tween decks of a tramp steamer that was actually built in Canada called the Canadian Inventor for 62 days under conditions like this. The men were crowded, sweating hot in the summer, which this voyage was. There was no sanitation. Over to the right of the image, you'll see a POW sitting on a bucket. You'll also see a man lying on the floor next to him. These were the conditions aboard the hell ships. This was a hell ship where nearly everyone survived. 62 days under these conditions, only one man died aboard this hell ship. It's amazing what they could experience. Many hell ships had many, many more deaths, and you're going to hear about that in some detail. Next slide, please. We're going to focus on the Oreokomaru and the subsequent ships that carried the men who were put aboard Oreokomaru. And we have a depiction, a cartoon of what it was like aboard this ship. This is not the voyage we're going to talk about today. This is a cartoon drawn by a senior officer who was transported aboard Oreokomaru in the rear hold, the same place where the POWs we'll hear about later today were buried. There were 260 men aboard the ship under these conditions. And you can't read it, but the captions say, "Oh God, it's hot. They can't do this to me. Turn on the fans." Just unbearable conditions for these senior officers. There were 260 on these, what's sometimes called dog kennels. In December of 44, there were 800 men in the same space. So you can only begin to imagine how awful it would be. Barely survivable with 260 and not survivable with 800. So you're going to hear about that. So next slide. I think we're going to turn it over to George Retelas, who's going to talk a bit about Air Group 11. Go ahead, George.
Hello, I'm George. I just would like to get a show of hands. How many of you in this crowd here today have a family member directly connected to the Bataan Death March? Raise your hand higher, please. I just want to acknowledge you and your families and appreciate you coming out here and that we never forget. Because as many of you know, history can repeat itself. And so, in a debt of gratitude, we just want to remember your family members because they also represent those that didn't make it back. So, thank you. Air Group 11 that served aboard the USS Hornet began in October of 44 and ended in January of 45. And in that time, this air group consisted of a fighter squadron, bomber squadron, and a torpedo squadron. And one of the aircraft you can see is the torpedo bomber right there, called the Avenger. During that time, their missions and strikes were over, near the Philippines and areas that many of the airmen who flew those missions never returned. And the reality is, a lot of the missions they went on, if you saw an enemy ship, you attacked it. And we didn't have the technology we have today to know friend or foe and immediate communications. It was just an airman in that canopy up there, usually with the air open, with muffled headsets and poor communication and just brand new radar. And if you saw an enemy ship, and it was marked that way, you had to attack. So that's as simple as short as anyone can express that. And many of the airmen who flew, as far as they knew, they went after the enemy. This is a very somber recognition and a way to kind of tally up what happened, you know, but that war was 80 years ago and we're still discovering new details. And to brush it aside and say that was then doesn't give the respect to have closure for family members that don't have answers. Whether it be a family that was on a hell ship and never made it off, or an airman who was shot down at sea and no body was found. So many of us are all here just to try to get some form of closure and answers that can help us heal and remember. And that's why I'm here. And my grandfather made it out. He survived, and so I hope to speak for those who didn't. And my dear friend here, Tim Hampton, his wife Katie, her great uncle was best friends with my grandfather, and Claude Haley was his name, and he never made it back. And so to reconnect with the great niece and her husband here, it's just a way to keep their stories alive in memories. And so being here at this remembrance is to now recognize and connect with all of you when this is over, with your family members, and remember those who didn't make it back. I could go into more detail, but I think we'll circle back as things come up with Air 11. But you can see this is the group that Claude Haley was with. It was a 3-man plane, like that one right there, and they never returned. So with that said, I'd like to pass on to the next slides here. There you go. Would you like to speak on this one? Well, yeah, so if you can imagine finishing 2 combat tours, bonding with all your friends, and on January 9th, 1945, towards the very end, with only maybe 2 weeks left, you don't make it back. Next slide.
So we're going to focus on today is the Oreokomaru. And this is one of the last vessels to leave Manila on December 13th, 1944. Now, after the Battle of the Philippine Sea in July, the United States Navy and Army started blockading tactics for the Philippines, to the point where American aircraft were seen over the Philippines at the end of September. Well, the Japanese then instituted a crash program to remove the remaining prisoners out of the Philippines and get them to their home islands or to Manchuria. And their central focus was the Cabanatuan POW camp. There were about 4,000 prisoners of war remaining at Cabanatuan. And on September 28, 1944, the Japanese High Command issued Order 1789, which ordered all of these prisoners out of the Philippines. They instituted basically a crash program. Well, the prisoners that we're going to talk about today left Cabanatuan between October 13th and October 17th, 1944, and were at Bilibid Prison. And they stayed at Bilibid from mid-October through December because of the constant air raids. Well, a typhoon came through the Philippines in the early part of December, and the Japanese were able to get one ship into Pier 7, which was the Oreokomaru. And it was going to be the last ship out of the Philippines before the retaking of the islands. So pretty much anybody that needed to get out of the Philippines was going to get out. The ship had over 3,000 Japanese civilians on board, plus about 1,621 American POWs. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the statistics. Again, 1,621 POWs were marched from Bilibid Prison down Pier 7 and loaded aboard into the Oreokomaru. And in the end of the day, this is the breakdown. Okay, only out of the 1,621 men, only 403 survived the war. Next, please. Okay, here is Bilibid Prison. December 12th, orders came down from General Quo's office, who was the commander of all POWs in the Philippines, to give medical exams to the prisoners remaining at Bilibid. And Captain Naranji Nogi, who was the chief Japanese medical officer at the camp, they pretty much had a mass medical inspection on the 12th,
and a roster was typed up. Next slide, please. Here's Pier 7. The men were marched from Bilibid Prison early in the morning of December 13th to Pier 7, where they awaited in those warehouses for the Japanese civilians to board. Next, please. Okay, here is Lieutenant Chester Britt, who was one of the survivors of the Oreokomaru, and his wife Grace, as she is being evacuated from the Philippines prior to the war. Next, please. And here is the general arrangement drawing and the loading plan of the Oreokomaru. And you'll notice that 3 of the holds were used to transport prisoners, and the smallest hold, the rear hold number 5, was holding the most prisoners. The Japanese had loaded the vessel the opposite of the way it should. Hold number 1 held about 650 prisoners, and hold number 2, the largest hold, had about 250 men. Okay, and each one of the holds was commanded by an American officer. And the conditions in the rear hold immediately started to deteriorate. Within 2 hours of the loading, we had our first casualty, an asthma attack. Next, please. Okay, here are the commanders of those 3 holds. In the rear hold was Commander Ward Ports. In the middle hold, the second hold underneath the superstructure, was Colonel Harold K. Johnson, who later became General Harold K. Johnson, Chief of Staff in the Army. And then Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Curtis Beecher commanded the holds in the front. Next, please. Okay, the Oreokomaru gets underway from Manila late afternoon on December 13th and stops off the coast of Corregidor that evening and takes on coals to her coal bunker. About 3 o'clock in the morning the next day, she gets underway and starts to head up the coast of Bataan. Next slide, please. Okay. John?
Good morning. Quick little bit about me. I don't have a Bataan veteran in the family. I don't have a World War II veteran in the family. I got going on this book when a friend of mine from high school said that a friend of ours from high school, Dave Britt, his father was on the Bataan Death March. I contacted Dave, one thing led to another, we started writing a book. When I started a few years ago, I knew that MacArthur said he was going to return, and I also knew that there was something called the Bataan Death March. I knew nothing. The past 3 years have been the biggest eye-opener probably of my life, and I've come to 2 conclusions. What the men did on Bataan, what the men did on Corregidor was nothing short of miraculous. I mean, I've never seen so many instances of bravery and courage and sacrifice in my life. The second thing is that I've come to respect the Filipino people so much. What they did, the more you read about it, the more you study, the more you learn, it's incredible. And I just have to absolutely tip my hat to the Filipino people for what they did for those years and the self-sacrifice they had, the guerrillas, the Philippine scouts, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to launch into this. My previous work in learning about World War II was just about like everybody else, whatever you read. I dug into this solidly for 3 years, and when we did this, I thought we'd be learning about Chester Britt. We learned about so many other men in the process, and everybody up here I have to thank. They've done nothing but incredibly helpful. People in the audience have been helpful too, so again, thanks to all of them. Okay, so the Oreokomaru, December 14th, it leaves, and it's got a couple of escorts going along, and at 9 a.m., records were that the ship was sighted by planes from the USS Hornet. The planes attacked the Oreokomaru, and then the next day, planes from the Hornet sink the Oreokomaru in Subic Bay. In doing this work, we've made a couple of interesting discoveries. We found out that the Oreokomaru was also attacked by planes from the USS Cabot on December 14th and 15th. We also learned that as one of the planes was attacking at Sueste Point, an American pilot from the Cabot was shot down. Multiple attacks going on for 2 days, and as you look at certain things here, I want you to think of a couple of things. First of all, it's the American POWs in the ship, And then it's also the Japanese civilians, a lot of women and children being evacuated back to Japan. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this ship is going along for Bilibid Prison. Pier 7, you saw that photo of Chester Britt with his wife being taken by his wife. That's the last photo she had of him until October 1945. They then go past Corregidor, around the corner. None of the men are seeing this, and they start getting attacked as it reaches up near the left side there. Next slide, please. Okay, in our research, we discovered there was a film of the Oreokomaru under attack. The film, the individual shot that's shown at 0900 on December 14th is actually the start of this attack film. And as you're watching it, that at the end was a 500-pound bomb just missing the ship. This is the only known film of any hell ship under attack during World War II. And I have to thank Tim Hampton down there because I found a grainy image in the National Archives. I showed it to Tim and he said, wow, I've got that from 2013. He just didn't realize it was in there because this is a 17-second clip in a 12-minute film and he downloaded many films. Okay, next slide, please. The other interesting thing is, by including the USS Cabot in there, a couple of old Hornet films start to take on added meaning. You look at the left-hand side film there, that's an early morning shot. There's the beach up along the shore where the Oreokomaru is beached. Very smooth sand. Later in the afternoon, you can see a big area there that's gouged out. In between that, 4 planes from the USS Cabot attack dropped 1,000-pound bombs each. All of them missed. 4 1,000-pound bombs, again, not smart bombs, gouged out all of that coral and sand along the edge and maybe even over on the side there. Okay, next slide, please. In the process of doing that, Lieutenant John Frank Thompson of the USS Cabot was killed. And you're probably asking, well, how is this missed? Well, it was a busy war, and they were identified simply as AP or APA, which is a naval code for a ship that's carrying troops. So the 2 carriers had no idea that they were attacking the same ship over those 2 days. And it was just simply lost in the clutter of all the paperwork of history and just happened to find it. So you're looking at what we call the last victim of the Oreokomaru. I've been in contact with somebody now, and I can't name the name, that hopefully is going to go over there and try to locate his plane in Subic Bay. And I'm really, really praying that can happen. Next slide, please. Okay, so the evening of December 14th, morning of the 15th, men are just going crazy in the ship. It's hell beyond imagination. In the morning of the 15th, all the Japanese civilians are offloaded. Now, that little bit of snippet of a film you saw before, there's about 16 or 1,800 Japanese civilians on the deck of that ship being ripped apart by 50 caliber machine gun bullets and rockets, women and children. So there are innocent victims of the war, just as we're seeing is happening over in the Ukraine right now. Okay, and then in the afternoon of the 15th, we're going to have, keep going please, next slide. Okay, afternoon of the 15th, this ship is attacked again, morning and the afternoon, and what you're seeing here is after the fantail of the ship has been hit by a 500-pound bomb, and it's now starting to capsize. The men are swimming ashore to what is called Olangapo, and I apologize if I pronounce that wrong for the Filipinos in the audience. But those little splashes you're seeing in the water are actually men swimming to shore about 300 yards. And on shore are Japanese Marines, and they're shooting at the men that are kind of drifting out of the zone because they don't want them to escape. So all of these men finally make it to shore and huddle along the seawall. Next slide, please. Okay, so these men have now come to shore. There's a lot of instances of bravery and heroism of the POWs at this point, men that are sick and weak and injured that have made it to the seawall, swimming back out and retrieving and bringing their friends in that can't make it. So a lot of lives were saved by other POWs that day. Next slide, please. And that's a picture of the seawall, which as you can see, it's pretty hard to scale it. So a lot of the men would come around the end, there's a beach at the end, and that's where they would come up. Next slide, please. And at this point, the men are now being herded into a tennis court. There's about 1,300 survivors, and that's a double-wide tennis court, and they're kept there for several days. And the attacks are going on around them, they're not hit again, but this is the end of kind of phase one of their misery, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark to continue on with the rest of what we got.
Well, the men are again held on the Alongabo tennis court from December 15th, and the first group leaves on the 20th. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a post-war picture of this tennis court, which is on the Subic Bay Navy base. During the day, the men were subjected to the heat. A lot of them had no clothes on. Lieutenant Toshino dispatches, the Japanese commander dispatches one of his privates to Manila to report the situation to Lieutenant General Kuo, who's the commander of the POWs in the Philippines. Kuo dispatches a man named Lieutenant Kempai Yuki with supplies to relieve the men on the tennis court. Okay? On the tennis court, many of the men were wounded, many of the men are sick. It's not a very good place. In fact, on the 20th of December, prior to leaving, Dr. Jack Schwartz had to amputate the arm of a U.S. Marine. Okay, next, please. Okay, after the tennis court, the Japanese transport by truck the remaining prisoners to San Fernando, Pampanga. And they're quartered in, the first group, which leaves on the 20th, is quartered in the Pampanga Provincial Jail. And the second group, which leaves midday on the 21st, is quartered in the Pampanga Theater. Okay, next, please. Okay, men are wounded, men are sick, men are dying. Upon arrival at the provincial jail, 2 men are dead within the first day. And then 5 more die after arrival at the theater the next day. Lieutenant General Kuo dispatches his adjutant, Lieutenant Urabe, with a medical master sergeant to San Fernando to assist Toshino. What is going on behind the scenes here is that Kuo has given orders to Urabe to tell Toshino to dispose of the men who cannot continue to make the journey. And this is going to be one of the worst war crimes in POW history. Well, the decision is made to murder the prisoners rather than send them back to Manila. Next slide, please. So the Japanese order American doctors to pick the 15 sickest and most wounded prisoners of war from the theater and the provincial jail for, quote, transport back to Manila. And they're picked up in trucks with the pretext of going back to Manila, where they were taken to a cemetery called the Campo Santo de San Fernando, outside of San Fernando, Pampanga, and one by one are murdered by the Japanese. Sergeant Tsukatoshi Tanoe was the medical master sergeant who was sent down from Lieutenant General Kuo's headquarters. He was ordered to carry out the execution. He personally beheaded 7 of the prisoners before he dropped his sword and asked to be relieved. Next. This is a quote from General Kuo's war crimes trial. This is where he is held culpable in the execution of these men at San Fernando. And this came out in Toshino's trial, Kuo's trial, and later on in a paper by the daughter of an American doctor. Okay. Next, please. Here is a picture of the Campo Santo de San Fernando. It is still there. And this is the scene of the execution of these prisoners of war. Next, please. All right. They are then taken from San Fernando by rail, from the San Fernando railhead to the La Union province in the Lingayen Gulf for further transport to Japan. And they arrived there Christmas morning and await transport on the Oreokomaru. Next, please. Okay, John.
Okay, so the night of the 25th, now these men have arrived at the train station. They have to march, many of them barefoot, because when they came out of the Oreokomaru, they lost their boots or their shoes or whatever they had. They marched about 3 kilometers barefoot through over coral ground to a beach at Coral Point on Lingayen Gulf, and we found this out, the following few details, by going through some war crimes trial affidavits. 2 Americans were to die on that beach over the next 2 days. The days are extremely hot. Nights in the Philippines are very, very cold at that time. Morning of the 27th, the POWs are herded to what we call the L-shaped pier, and they're pushed or forced to jump about 10 feet down into Japanese barges. The barges then take them out to the two ships, the Oroyoku Maru or the Brazil Maru, and they had to do this because it was too shallow for the boats or the ships to pull into this pier. Next, please. Okay, and this is through, again, part of the research, we've been able to identify the actual pier that these men were on. We located one photo that was taken by the USS Ticonderoga on December 15th, and if you look down at the end there, there's a symbol for the USS Ticonderoga. This was after they were bombing some oil storage tanks. And just up at the top, you can see this little L-shaped thing. That's where the men last stepped foot on about 2 weeks later, a week and a half later. This photo is being taken while the Oreokomaru is being bombed. So this is the north part of the Philippines, Luzon. Oreokomaru is down in the southern part of Luzon. And then that is, over on the left side is a photo of that pier from ground level, which I located. It was actually used by the OSS. They got a hold of pre-war photos and then would take these and use them for planning for the later invasion of American forces. Next, please. Okay. And do you want to take it? Sure.
Okay, here are artist renditions of the Oreokomaru and the Brazil Maru. The Oreokomaru was the Japanese standard 2A class freighter. They had their own version of a Liberty ship. These were mass produced. The Oreokomaru was one of these vessels. And the Brazil Maru was actually a World War I built Kawasaki freighter. And it was part of their contribution to the Allied war effort during World War I. Next, please. All right, well, on January 9th, actually the prisoners arrive in Formosa on January 1st. And while cargo operations are going on, the prisoners remain on board. On January 6th, the Japanese decide to move the prisoners off the Brazil Maru and put everybody aboard the Oreokomaru and continue operations. Well, USS Hornet, Air Group 11's guys, find the nest of ships in Takao Harbor on January 9th and proceed to attack. And this is actual close-up of one of the strike photos. The Oreokomaru is the ship on the outbound. You can see where a bomb is hit the forward hull. And the ship next to her is the Oreokomaru, which is a tanker version of the Oreokomaru. Next, please. Here's the zoom out photograph of the strike from Air Group 11. This is Takao Harbor, or Kaohsiung now. Next, please. And this is the prisoner of war positions aboard the Oreokomaru. If you look at the general arrangement drawing, the blue areas are where the prisoners of war that sustained a bomb hit were hit. And then the second hole. Next, please. Okay. Here's a drawing by Colonel Eugene Jacobs, who was a doctor aboard the Oreokomaru. Because of the bomb hit the girders and all the steel just rained down on the prisoners in the forward hold, and it killed about 411 men. Next, please. Another artist rendition from Colonel Jacobs about the Oreokomaru. Next, please. And here's some of the prisoners of war from the Oreokomaru ordeal, and their fates. Next, please. And then after the prisoners are taken off the Oreokomaru, the dead ones are taken off the Oreokomaru and buried ashore at Takao Formosa, the remaining 900 or so prisoners of war are placed on the Brazil Maru and taken to Japan. It was about a 15-day journey from Taiwan to the Shimonoseki Straits of Moji, Japan, and about 400 men died of exposure and wounds between Formosa and Japan. Next, please. Here's a general arrangement of the Brazil Maru, where the prisoners were located from Taiwan to Japan. And below that, again, is a drawing by Colonel Eugene Jacobs of what it was like to be on the Brazil Maru between Formosa and Japan. And one interesting note, Private Robert Brownlee was the only African American on board the Oreokomaru, and he had quite a reputation amongst the men. His story is very, very interesting. And he was commended by the officers in his unit, and he unfortunately died aboard the Brazil Maru about 3 days before the Brazil Maru docked in Mochi, Japan. Next, please. Okay, well, The Brazil Maru arrives at the Moji Pilot Station the late evening on the 28th, takes her pilot, and bursts at the Moji docks early the next morning on the 29th. The men are held aboard ship, Japanese quarantine officers board, and start to assess the situation. Okay? They arrived in Japan with 581 men on board, but only 547 left the ship because 30 died on that day. Okay? Well, next please. Well, the men are moved from the Moji docks to the receiving building in Moji and divided amongst 5 different places. The Kakura Military Hospital, Fukuoka Camp number 1, number 3, number 4, and number 17. Okay, next please. Well, the Kakura Military Hospital was attached to Fukuoka 22. This is where the serious cases were taken. 110 men were immediately transported from the receiving building in Moji to this Kakura Military Hospital. This is where my grandfather died 5 days after they arrived in Japan. Next, please. This is a picture of the post-war picture of the Kakura Hospital. The first ward was for dysentery patients. The second ward was for surgical patients. This is the room my grandfather died in on February 4th, 1945. Next, please. Here is his picture along with his death certificate from the Kakura Military Hospital. Okay. Next, please. Well, as Dr. Erickson said, after the men arrived in Japan, more of them died because of the conditions on the hell ship. At Fukuoka number 1, 55 of the 193 died. At Fukuoka number 3, 24 of the 100 died. At Fukuoka number 4, which is the YMCA campus there in Moji, 13 die out of 50. And at Fukuoka 17, only 10 die out of 96, and that's an interesting story for a later time. The worst case was the Kakura Hospital. 110 were taken there, 76 died within a week. Next, please. Okay, John? Okay. On April 26th, after the men recover, the survivors are moved to the docks of Fukuoka and Moji, and they are sent to Busan, Korea. The treatment on board this ship was very decent. The men were very pleased with their treatment. The ship was heated, they were fed. And an interesting note, Major Thomas Smothers, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Smothers brothers. This was their father. He dies aboard the ferry between Japan and Korea. He was also in the Kakura Hospital. He actually survived that. Well, the ferry arrives in Korea, and half the men are taken to Jensen POW camp in Korea, and the other half are taken to Camp Houghton in Buckton. Next, please. Okay, here is a post-war postcard that John gave us about the Oreokomaru, which is the ferry between Korea and Japan, which our men were taken over there on. Okay, next, please. And the last POW to die at the Jensen camp was Captain George Burnett. Yes. Sorry. Okay, can you hear me now? I thought my voice was loud. I apologize. So the last POW to die from the Oreokomaru was Captain George Burnett, Texas A&M grad. He died on the 4th of July, 1945 in Korea. Well, as the war ended on August 15th, there was a little bit of delay in liberation. The teams had to get there, the recovery teams had to get there to get the men out. So, and this later led to July 4th, 1946, to Philippine independence. Next, please. Well, here's a picture of the Mukden camp, and the OSS liberated this camp, or dropped a team in there on August 16th, and meets the Oreokomaru survivors. Next, please. Well, the Oreokomaru survivors a lot of them end up on the hospital ship, the USS Haven. And on board the hospital ship is a reporter from Chicago, the Chicago Daily News, named George Weller. Weller starts to interview these men. And because of the censorship rules, the reports start to get to General MacArthur. So General MacArthur personally reads Weller's work and starts an investigation into the Oreokomaru ordeal. And after the investigation starts, MacArthur gives permission to publish the story of the Oreokomaru in American newspapers around November of 1945. Next one. Okay.
We're going to begin the Q&A in a moment.
Okay. What's that? Okay. Next slide, please. One more time. Keep going. Okay. Okay, the story is still being written, okay?
In November of 2020, the Defense Department announced the Oreokomaru project, which is going to attempt to ID the casualties from the Oreokomaru from the January 9th bombing. And continue, please. And here's the hero in all of this. This is the reason why we have a lot of the information about the Oreokomaru that we have. This is Major Robert Kahn. Major Kahn, after the ordeal was over, compiled a list of the dead. And this list was presented to the war crimes trials after the war. And he is the reason why we not only have a casualty list for the Oreokomaru, but we also have the Cabanatuan. He was the grave registration officers at Cabanatuan. Next, please. Here are the perpetrators, Lieutenant Toshino, Mr. Wada, and Captain Kajiyama from the Oreokomaru. Next, please. And here's Lieutenant Toshino. He was sentenced to death for his role in the ordeal. Next, please. Okay. Jim?
We're going to open it up for questions and answers now. So does anyone in the crowd have a question for any of the panel? Any aspect of it? Yes?